Welcome to The Hidden Truth, Breaking the Silence. I'm your host, Jonathan McClernand. Each episode, we explore stories of individuals and how they've been affected by being a part of a secretive Christian fellowship. The stories shared here may include speaking about sensitive topics suited for a mature audience. Dysfunction happens when doctrine meets dogma and silence is paramount. So let's pull back the veil on today's episode of The Hidden Truth. All right, welcome back to today's episode. It's my pleasure today to be speaking with Isabel Chung. Isabel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thanks for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Usually the first thing I always like to ask my guests is really just kind of your backstory, your connection to the 2x2 Fellowship, and what that's been like through kind of like your family history and then your history with it.
Sure. So I grew up in the 2x2 Fellowship, or I just often refer to it as the church. But yeah, my mom actually was one of the first to profess in Korea. So I actually want to make a note of this because you know how revisionist history happens. So she was not the first, she was not the only person to profess in the first meeting that was tested. She was one of several, but there was only a couple that continued. But this was like in the mid 1950s, right after the Korean War. And so, yeah, and then she met my dad, and the rest is history that way. But I actually was born here in the U.S., so my parents came over in the mid 1960s to the States as immigrants, and I do have two older brothers, and so they were born in Korea. But yeah, so it like, well, I think part of this is cultural, but you know, part of it is you know, from the church. But you know, we really do sort of put people on pedestals who were, you know, the first family to profess someplace, or you know, or the first person to profess. And it just always kind of struck me, like, you know, just by virtue of the fact that I was born into this family that had some kind of status. But there's also, you know, that kind of expectation to live up to that reputation of, you know, being the first family.
Right.
So that was always something that kind of irked me.
Yeah, fair
But
enough. Yeah, and that's kind of an interesting observation as well. I mean, because let's say I come from a relatively unknown family, not not sure how much my family will entitle. I mean, I definitely have support. Thanks, mom and dad. I appreciate your support.
Mhm.
But I'd say we come from a family of relatively low renown or estate. I guess we're not very big, not that well known within the fellowship. But I agree. I think there's an aspect of maybe us as human beings and as members of this fellowship where maybe we feel like it's faith confirming or reassuring to hear stories of the work of God or the Spirit of God accomplishing a work, or what we view to be the Spirit of God accomplishing a work in someone else's life. And so we're looking for some kind of maybe inspiration or reassurance or things like that. One of the things, I think my brother who lives over in Turkey, he and he's not on social media, so but you know, he over Turkey is where the 7 churches of in Revelation are found on the west coast of Turkey. And one of the things my brother remarked about was that I think it was in Ephesus, within 100 years of Jesus' death, they were already making statues of the apostles in Ephesus.
Interesting.
So it's like there is this tendency of human beings to kind of seek out and find other human beings and even almost like give them some kind of status.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, it's like the whole reason why royalty worked for so many years, right? Um
Yeah.
just I don't know. I don't I don't pretend like I understand the psychology that goes into that.
For sure. And for yourself, as a child, kind of growing up in this fellowship, where in the U.S. Were you raised, and What do you recall about it being a child?
Yeah, so I was born in New York and we lived in upstate New York till I was 5. And then when I was 5, we moved to the Chicago area to a suburb
Mhm.
called Evanston. Um, and so, I mean, basically, my experience was that, you know, like my parents, especially my mom, really like sort of idolized the workers. So, I mean, we had an open home for the workers, not necessarily, well, to a certain degree, the friends, but the workers always they always had like um top entrance passes to stay with us,
Right.
and
Yeah.
oftentimes on very short or no notice at all. And we were always expected to basically, you know, drop everything and be there to visit with them. And as as the girl, I was expected to help with, the cooking and cleaning and so forth. Um, but yeah, so I professed the first time I professed, I was 10 years old. But like in the 2 years leading up to that, I was constantly afraid of dying.
Mhm.
So, back in the day, I guess nowadays, they don't really use this approach as much, but back in the day, it was very common to, to send the message like, if you die outside the truth, you're going to a lost eternity. And, oftentimes, um, and when they tested a meeting, they like Saturday night at convention. I don't know if that still goes on,
It
but
does. Yep.
okay. So back in the day, like Saturday night at convention was the the time that you heard stories about like, you know, that one guy who grew up in a professing family and he never professed and died, in a tragic car accident outside the fold, and
Mm.
like stories like that. And I just remember at convention time, um, you know, like especially the year that I professed, I don't think I slept for that entire convention or very
Right.
little
Yeah.
because I was like, I literally remember praying at night, please God, let me live till Saturday night so that I can profess. Um,
Yeah.
so
That's a lot. That's a heavy weight for a child to carry. This fear of like I might die. I have to profess so I don't die and go to hell, basically.
right, right.
And I have to say, like, I've come to believe I really don't believe that God wants us to experience that level of burden, especially as children. Like, yes, we want to have an understanding that there's a serious element to life and that life has a finite nature to it. But to be terrified as a child that like I might die and go to hell, and so just keep me alive for a couple more days so I can do this thing that will stop me from a horrible end.
Hmm.
Yeah, that in itself, I think has an element of trauma connected to it.
Oh, for sure. And I think that the the element of fear, like placing that fear of God in you from a very young age, is like so instrumental in keeping everybody, in check, so to
Mhm,
speak.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, I'm kind of deviating from my story, but
That's okay. So yeah, but I think that's really valuable experience to share. And so you professed at the age of 10, and I don't know if you felt a sense of relief or what it felt like for you to kind of be professing growing up. Do you recall, just in terms of like your social life, maybe school life, things like that, like what interactions were like, and if there was any sort of difficulty or awkwardness connected to your participation in the fellowship?
oh, for sure. I had a great reunion with a childhood friend from school, and I just asked him, just out of curiosity, how did you remember me? And of course, he remembered the really long hair down past my rear end,
Mhm, mhm.
that I would wear in a long braid, or Um, and he didn't remember the skirts, but he was a
Mhm.
guy, so I don't know if but
Right.
I remember you know, wearing skirts and then feeling like in the middle of winter when it was so cold and sometimes we'd be allowed to wear pants under our skirts
Mhm.
and just, feeling kind of, well, for one thing, mortified because, other kids would always just like laugh and, be like, why are you wearing a skirt with, pants under it? And,
Right.
but also just, you know, feeling like I'm also sinning because I'm wearing pants in public. And so it's like this mixed bag of, well, I don't know which was worse, but um
Right.
hard.
My parents made me do it, so, to try and give you an out or something like that, but yeah, I think a lot of us, I'd say I'm middle-aged, but with a young family, we're pausing and considering some of the performative nature of what it is that we do, and,
Mhm.
have we mixed up tradition with what's actually essential for salvation?
Yeah.
And yeah, and so and I think one of the things that you're touching on here that's really important too, because I don't necessarily have that lived experience of being a woman inside this fellowship and the struggle. I think with the women in the fellowship, so much more weight is placed on them with regards to their outward appearance than is
Mhm.
men. There's still some pressures, but it seems like it's much more pressure with women.
Yeah. And I know a lot of that's changed too, just based on the fact that I still have friends in the church. But yeah, I did want to caveat like my whole
Hmm.
conversation with you with just a clear statement about something. Like I decided to do this um, because I wanted to speak out for survivors.
Hmm.
Um, so I just want to be really clear. I'm not here to dismantle the church, and I do have some positive memories of my time in the church. And I have friends who are still going to meetings, and they like I'm just really keenly aware, especially these days, that we all have such individual journeys. Like, we all are on our own individual spiritual journey that's largely been shaped by our own unique experiences.
Hmm.
And like, it doesn't make sense for me to um try to dissuade anyone from their um like their choices um just because I had this very different and quite frankly horrible experience.
Mm,
um
absolutely. And I
um
appreciate you sharing that. I think it's important, and for those who've watched the trailer to this podcast, recognize I'm still an active member of the fellowship.
okay, I wasn't sure about that. Yeah.
Well, at this point in time, I remain an active member of the fellowship, and
Hmm.
so the intention, yeah, isn't to tear down, but it is to shine a light
Yeah.
and shine a light on the things that are, yeah. So we're not here to tear anything down, but we are here to shine a light on the ugly and the evil that has manifested itself within this fellowship. And so, yeah, rather than tear down, shine a light. And so, um, back to your kind of your story and your experience, and you shared some kind of difficult things there or difficult experiences that you had. But um, so as kind of life goes on for you through your teen years, um, what else kind of stands out to you about your experience?
Well, so I actually lost out when I was in college. Actually, I lost out multiple times in my 20s, to be frank.
Mhm.
But I professed the second time um, when I was 21. And yeah, did like just in and out of meetings for most of my 20s until probably, well, I shouldn't say most of my 20s, until I was probably about, I don't know, 24, 25, somewhere in there. And then I actually, I don't, again, I don't know if they still do this, but I um, started feeling like I was being troubled to go into the work. And so I ultimately did offer when I was 27. Um, and I went back home to my parents just to wait for a few months. And it everything kind of came to a head at that time. And so I left, like I completely stopped when I was about 28 to 29.
Mhm, mhm. And ultimately, what was it that prompted you to well, you felt that you were troubled about the ministry, and then something prompted you to say, "I feel like I can't go through with this." What was it that prompted you to withdraw your offer to be part of the ministry?
Yeah, well, there were probably multiple factors. I mean, there were multiple factors. I, I've come a long ways as far as like my own personal healing is concerned. So I see things differently now than I did then. But at that time, I just generally had this sense that um, I just felt like as a worker, if I became a worker, I didn't know if I would fully believe what I was preaching. Um, and that is basically like, this is the only way, this is the only true way, everybody else is going to hell. Like, what a horrible
Mhm.
message to send to anyone. Um, and then also, I couldn't stomach the idea of sort of being subject to, you know, many, like the hierarchy of the work.
Mhm.
Um, and I didn't fully understand why at the time, but I often had like experiences where I just had this sort of visceral feeling like something was really wrong with like a certain worker. So, for example, Leslie White, I never liked that man. That was back in the day when everybody was like worshiping him. And I just felt like I was, you know, that in and of itself like made me feel like, somehow I was a sinner, but also like, that I just wasn't being true to myself. I wasn't being authentic if I, went along with the whole game of, let's adore Leslie White.
Right. And, if you don't mind, because his name has come up a lot, because of some
Hmm.
of the heinous things that he has done. What was your experience, with Leslie White? Like, was he overseer of your state? Was he in your field? What sort of things did you experience with him?
Yeah. Well, so let's see. When I was in college, he was in, um, like part of the time that I was in college, he was in my state. I don't think he was in our field. I can't remember. But I do remember having visits with him. He often like sort of really enjoyed. I had two roommates in college who were also professing. We shared an apartment, and he enjoyed coming over and like I don't know, just having visits with us. And um, but I personally, I like I never had so I don't consider myself a victim of him or, a survivor of his abuse, but I mean, I just always had like generally sort of like this creepy feeling around him. And I couldn't
Mhm.
put a finger on it. Like I just thought he was just fake. And I do remember having I don't know if I'd call them arguments, but like sort of debates on stuff and with him. and I don't even remember what. I'm guessing most likely they had to do with the woman's place in the church because that's something that he always preached on.
Mm-mm. Funny that an abuser would do that.
Yeah, exactly, and being subject and all of that.
Mm-mm.
Um,
And yeah. So I wonder if some of that sense of debate or dissent with what he expressed came from maybe you didn't fully understand at the time, but a recognition that this is a man who's weaponizing those scriptures to lay the
yeah,
groundwork for the abuses he would commit.
yeah, and I found this to be the case over the years with in many instances. Like I I feel like if you've survived childhood trauma, childhood abuse, sometimes you develop almost like a sixth sense for you know who not to trust. Um, and then also, I feel like I can identify another survivor, even if like they never mention anything. Like I can sense it. Like there's some kind of way we experience the world that um, is just it's very unique.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned you yourself were not a victim necessarily of Leslie White, but if I understand correctly, that you yourself are a survivor. And if you're comfortable, what would you like to share about that experience that you endured?
Yeah. I'm I'm a survivor of multiple forms of childhood abuse, including sexual and physical abuse.
Hmm.
Um, the perpetrators were in my family, and there were multiple incidents. And I, um, I think I learned from a very early age, how to try to sort of stand up to things that like stand up to people who made me feel uncomfortable. Um, but at the same time, I also learned that this was something that I had to keep quiet to keep that whole um, Chung family, you know, image
Image.
going.
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
Um, so one of the perpetrators. Well, first I want to preface this by saying that my experience with each of the perpetrators is very different. Like my relationship evolved in different ways with each of the perpetrators. Um, and there's one feature or one characteristic in one perpetrator that didn't appear or doesn't appear in another perpetrator, and that is that one showed remorse. Even though he never apologized, even though he never openly acknowledged it, he did show remorse, and he also showed like an awareness that what he was doing or what he did was wrong.
Hmm.
Um, the other one, to this day, no remorse, actually continues to be verbally and psychologically abusive. Um, so, I've had to cut a lot of ties. Um,
Hmm. It's incredibly painful to have to experience that. Um, if I may ask, what age were you when the first time that you experienced abuse?
well, from what I can remember, and that's really important, I was approximately 9 years old. Um, and well, I remember like different incidents. I remember things like, learning from a very young age that it was it was important to be silent, not just to protect the family image, but to protect myself.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, so, uh, yeah, and obviously, there's a lot of there's a lot of challenges that arise from keeping everything um, to oneself. Um,
Mhm.
so, um, but yeah, so the one who I felt like showed remorse was my dad,
Mhm.
and I I actually confronted him um, just like a few years before he died. Um, and the reason why I did that was because I actually had told some family members, um, well, a family member about what he did. And I
Mhm.
was concerned about there being other victims, um,
Right.
including my nephew and niece. So, if I didn't have a nephew and niece, I probably would have just, left it alone because
Mhm.
um, after I had survived to a certain age, I realized that even if I got an acknowledgement and an apology, um, it really wouldn't be for me. It would be for him,
Mhm, mhm.
um, which would have been fine. But it wasn't really important to my healing. Um,
Right.
but it was important to, you know, just, yeah, one of my biggest fears was that, there was other people.
Absolutely, and if I could ask just in terms of clarification, what was, it sounds like your family name or the reputation in one sense was kind of weaponized, like, in terms of helping you to or causing you to remain silent, and was there ever sort of any scriptural, used, to also sort of coerce or create fear or to try to basically have you maintain silence?
Hmm. I don't remember any like actual scriptural references that were used. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm
Um,
just wondering, uh, mostly because I've heard from, and I should have asked the question better, but I've heard from other survivors and this is sort of expressed an experience that their abusers have used, maybe not necessarily specific scripture or verses, but essentially the fear of God to coerce them into remaining silent about what they experience.
oh, I mean, absolutely. So there was like there is a lot of shaming that's involved, and this is something that I really want to sort of emphasize in our conversation. So just to back up a few steps, when I thought about, when after Dean Brewer and all the months and following after that, and all the stories uh, that were coming out, and survivors posting online or giving interviews or whatnot. Um, you know, I I did think about it for several months, and I was just like, "Ugh, I don't know if I want to do that, and I just yeah, there's so many things that go into deciding whether or not you want to share your story. But I asked myself, like, so, like, for example, I was worried that like people at work would find out. And, oh, do I wanna go to work and, with the knowledge that, people might know, these really personal things. And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, well, so what? Like, so I realized it was because, you know, it's always been my secret, you know, and there is the shame that goes along with it. But how wrong is that thinking? You know, the shame is
Mm-hmm.
on the perpetrators. The shame
Absolutely.
is on the enablers too. Um, and so I mean, there are sins of commission, sins of omission, overseers, um,
Complicity.
yeah, workers who just, you know, they um, move perpetrators across state lines, all that they
Right.
do. Um,
Mm-hmm.
to me, they are also perpetrators. They are
Mm.
perpetrating sins of omission,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
even if they haven't committed anything themselves.
Right. And I feel like this is something that, pardon me, that many of us have wrestled with.
Hmm.
We know that this fellowship, the nature of this fellowship, has been one that sort of avoided any kind of spotlight. I'm not suggesting there should be a major spotlight. You did actually mention one other thing I want to touch on briefly, and that is the fear of speaking out and what will it cost.
Yeah, yeah,
It's it's very real. I mean, I
yeah,
think I have work contracts that are completely unrelated to this. What happens if a client happens to come across this this that I'm doing? I mean, obviously, I feel very moved and compelled to be listened to share stories. But I think what happens if a company that I have a contract with finds out that I'm doing something like this? Will they
mhm,
say this tarnish? We can't be connected to you, even though you do good work, or things like that, right? Those things come up, and
yeah,
so I think, and that's a relatively minor thing on my end. I think what a victim, and as you talked about, like as they share their story and go public with it, this is why it can be so difficult. Why there's so many victims, and people may ask, well, why does it take a victim so many years to come forward? And it's like it's a very nuanced and multi-layered, multifaceted experience for someone to come forward and share their story.
yeah, absolutely. And it's actually pretty common. I mean, not just within the church, but you
Mm-mm.
know, across the board. A survivor of child abuse, they typically, if they do, um, you know, decide to openly share what they went through, they typically do so in their middle ages. And
Mm-mm.
it's because, you know, they're, I think in the, you know, for the most part, it's pretty safe to say that, you know, to make it to your middle ages, you're really just um, trying to make it through the day to day,
Mm-mm.
and it's not like, yeah, it's it's not a smooth ride. Um,
Yeah.
so
And so then, if I may ask, with your experience and what you went through, the abuse that you suffered, um, did that have a role in what we describe as, like, I don't even like the term lost out anymore, but like leaving and coming back and leaving, coming back, to like sort of wrestling with, do I want to be a part of this fellowship or not? Uh, the abuse that you suffered, how did that factor into this sort of back and forth, whether or not you wanted to be a part of this fellowship?
hmm, yeah, well, it factored directly into it because you know how I mentioned I went back home to for a
Hmm.
waiting period. Um, I don't know why I did this, but I think maybe my mom wanted to keep the upstairs for guests. But anyways, I took the downstairs bedroom. So my brothers used to have a their bedroom in the basement. It was like a, you know, whatchamacallit. It was a refinished basement.
Right.
And
Yeah.
um but that place was actually, that room was where um probably the, well, one of the worst events happened.
Hmm.
Um and so when I was 16, my one of my brothers, um basically, I was down in that room and I was studying, and he had a radio, and he told me to turn off the radio because I can't study when the radio's on. And so I was a little bit of a sassy mouth at times, and like, if something didn't make sense to me, I said no, or I said so. In this instance, I was like, actually, I'm concentrating just fine. And you know, I think I don't like I said I don't want to turn off the radio or something like that. Anyways, I refused, and I don't know if I think he might have asked like 2, 3 times, and I kept saying no. Anyways, he just lost his temper and he started hitting me across the face. Um, so my parents were out of the house, and it went on for a while. And you know, there's a lot of literature on like the way, you know, the reasons why victims um react in the way they do. I think, you know, when anyone is undergoing any kind of trauma, you don't necessarily act rationally, right? So, I mean, you think of like, you know, people who, um, you know, try to escape like a fire, and maybe they have a kid and they're trying to bring the kid's stroller with, like, like,
Mm-mm-mm.
you just don't act rationally, like rational, a
You're not in your
rational.
rational brain at that time.
Yeah, exactly. Your rational brain would just say, let's leave the stroller behind, take the kid and run. Um, so anyway, I was there for quite a while, and basically ended up at one point I ended up on the floor, and um, I just, remember there was a desk. I mean, I saw that there was a desk there, his desk, and I crawled under that desk, and um, but at the end he was kicking me. And so thankfully my parents came home. Um, but when I was under the desk and I looked up at him at one point, and remember I was 16. He was actually 25 at that time. Um, and I just like remember back then we didn't have TV. You know, I don't think at that point I may have like watched a movie or two at a school friend's house or something like that. But this wasn't part of like a normal imagination from somebody who grew up with, you know, like watching horror movies or something like
Mm-mm.
that. But um, I just remember looking up at him, and he was just checked out. And um, I remember thinking that this is death, that I was looking at death. I wasn't looking at my brother.
Mhm.
But of course it was my brother. So, um, but, you know, went to meeting several days afterwards. I have no idea how long afterwards, but, my face was black and blue. Um, and the elder's wife, after meeting, asked me what happened. And I told her, I fell down the stairs. And I knew the way she looked at me that she didn't believe that story. So,
Mhm.
um, actually, I heard not too long ago. I don't know why, but that's kind of like a common um, thing that survivors say, um, you know, after they, if somebody asks them what happened, like if they're visible bruises, they say they fell down the stairs.
That
Like,
same thought occurred to me. I was like, I've heard that before. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, but fast forward through the years, can you give me 1 second, please?
Yeah, by all means. Mm.
So, yeah, I think that, you know, well, I know the elder's wife didn't believe me for a second, and
Yeah.
um, but my whole family. Well, actually, I don't think my second brother was there, but you know, um, so the brother who did this was my oldest brother, or is my oldest brother. Um, he was there. My parents were there, and they heard me say, I fell down the stairs. Um, there was also a lady who she's still surviving today, um, who she was single at that time, but she was a nurse practitioner. And I remember her looking at me and, she would have known that
Mhm,
that
mhm.
wasn't from falling down the stairs. So at any rate, that, yeah, so that just kind of, I chose to tell that example or tell about that incident because I think that was really the time when, like, I owned the shame, like, you
Mhm.
know, and that was the time when, like, the silencing began.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and to this day, he does not like it when I speak up on numerous. He is always trying to silence, literally.
Mhm.
Like, I was at an appointment with him, with my mom, and he's standing there, you probably can't see, but, like, going like
Mm.
this to me because he doesn't want me, like, um, answering any questions that it was a physical therapist, was asking. And, I mean, she was just asking, like, some basic questions, like, um, just about my mom getting up and down from a wheelchair and stuff like that.
Right, right.
So, um, but yeah.
So I guess I'm curious, and obviously you're looking back now through the lens of hindsight, but were you aware whether or not your oldest brother himself was a victim of abuse?
So interesting you asked that. I mean, he definitely had some issues. I've been told that, um, so I've been told that, it's better not to talk about other people's potential abuse. Um, but let me put it this way. It wouldn't surprise me.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and I mean, he had some trauma in his childhood too. Um,
Right.
and I recognize that. So, for many years, because first he never apologized. Or well, hold that thought. I want to go back to that a little bit
We'll
later.
come back
But
to that. Yeah.
um, but yeah, I mean, um, I think you know, I just excused it for many years because I was cognizant of what he went through as a kid.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
when my parents came to the U.S., they couldn't afford to bring the whole family over at once. So he was only 3 years old when my dad left, and then 4 years old when my mom left. So
Mhm.
same age as your oldest son, right? So
Mm.
can you imagine, what it would be like for your son to, have be
Yeah.
separated from his parents at that age?
Awful. And I know now he's particularly attached to me as dada, and so I think,
Mm,
yeah, that would be absolutely heartbreaking. And
yeah.
I think why, and I agree, and I appreciate your understanding that, like, each individual story is not necessarily for us to share, but maybe to shed a light on just a degree of understanding to, and it's not to excuse behavior, but and it's not to say that every victim becomes an abuser, but
Thank
to
you.
at least understand sometimes where behavior comes from, because
Right.
as we observe, is there's very often a cyclical nature to abuse.
Yeah.
um, and it takes quite a remarkable person to be able to break that cycle, because there is, I mean, I'm a survivor of violent trauma too. There was a part
Mhm.
of me that wanted to take from someone else what I felt had been taken from me, for lack of a better term or
Mm,
explanation. I couldn't explain why there were I had violent urges. I'm not a violent
interesting.
person, but in when I was really wrestling with PTSD in a way that I could, and I had no idea what was happening to me.
Yeah.
And I felt horribly ashamed of these urges and impulses, and I never acted on them. But
Right.
I mean, if so nobody could see the torment I was experiencing in my head
Mhm.
about these visions and things that I would have of me inflicting violence on other people. But
Mm.
one of the ways I think I reconciled or tried to understand is this was, I was trying to take back something that had been taken from me.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, wow, that makes sense. That makes so much sense. Like, yeah. Like and yeah, my experience um with this brother since then has been that there's like this jealousy that he has. And it's like, yeah, I can see some of that, what you just described.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
but like, I think the important take home message is, abuse is abuse. And I know
mm,
you
mhm.
agree with this. Like, you know,
And
um, we, whether you've experienced it yourself and, you know, are acting out of, some kind of like you're acting out in a very unhealthy way in response to your abuse. Like abuse is abuse. So, um,
mm. I think, if I may, um,
yeah,
if I was to carry out violent actions in response to the abuse I suffered, my actions are not justified by my own experiences of abuse.
thank you. Yeah.
Mhm. Yes, and I think, I try to explain my understanding of compassion to people, and I say compassion is not enabling. It's not saying it's okay for you to do something that's harmful,
Hmm.
but it's gaining a degree of understanding why the behavior occurs, so that we might actually have the opportunity to change patterns or cycles of behavior, um,
Yeah.
in the future.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask something else that you may or may not be able to answer, but when you hear the question, you'll probably understand why I'm asking it. But your relationship to your father, so your father was one of your abusers.
Hmm.
Was there positive aspects to that relationship? Was there like a fatherly aspect? Like, in other words, were you shown affection or love in other ways, that sort of made it a confusing dynamic?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Like, um, we had a very classic father-daughter relationship. And, you know, I'm the only girl. I'm the
Mhm.
youngest. I'm 7 and 9 years younger than my brothers. Um, and, he didn't have, I mean, probably all kinds of reasons. Like he didn't have as much opportunity to be with my brothers when they were younger as he did with me. Um,
Mhm.
and, you know, yes, there were many sort of tender moments that I remember where he was genuinely like a caring father. Like, he was always the one. He wanted to be a vet at one point in his life, so
Mhm.
you know, he was always the one to. If I fell, I remember once falling and cutting my chin open. And he would be the one to clean it up and bandage it up and so on.
Mhm.
Um, but you know, some of those things were positive, but then there were other aspects of um, you know, his affection that were very wrong.
Absolutely.
And um, I mean, just to kind of fast forward, so my journey with him, my relationship with him was very difficult. It was a lot of ups and downs.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and like I finally got to recognize um, that this thing that he had an illness. And so just like you would see maybe like an alcoholic would have an illness, like, they may be the nicest person in the world, but they have an illness that makes them do things that might be harmful to others.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's kind of how I like distance myself from what he did. Um, and in his later year, especially when he was sick, we connected.
Mhm. And I think, this is another one of these complicating factors in the situation because we want to it would almost give greater satisfaction if we could just paint abusers as absolutely cold and heartless, predatory, calculating monsters, but it's not always the case.
Yeah,
They're a complicated human being, and yet again, this is not to excuse patterns of behavior, harm, abuse, or anything like that, but to say,
right,
imagine as a child the confusing nature of this dynamic where on one hand or in one experience you experience like the genuine love of a caring father who wants to protect and nurture a daughter, and then on the other hand you experience terrible abuse at the hands of that same individual. The sort of level of confusion that creates. And
right.
then we think about other people and how they may have perceived your father. Maybe they perceived him as a godly man. I don't know if he was an
Yeah,
elder or anything like that, but
he was.
right. And so then they perceive, well, this is what we know of this man, that we hear
Yeah,
him speak in meetings, we hear him take the meetings, we see him shake hands, we see him do all these things that give all of the appearances of a good person.
yeah,
But there's this dark side over here. And that's because one of the things I've also tried to understand is why it appears that so many people are willing to be willfully ignorant about this. And it's almost like we don't want this idealistic illusion to be shattered because we're not sure that we can actually bear the actual truth of this
yeah,
situation.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I've thought of that many times. Like, you know, um, I had somebody in my family apologize to me just the other day. Because I talked to her about what was going on and what had happened. I told her, I gave her, she knew a little bit, but I gave her some more details, and um, she apologized because she just she felt like she could have showed up for me, but I told her not to do that because you know we it's I don't know, I hear the term cognitive dissonance. I don't know if that's applicable here, but basically it's like this disconnect. It's like, you know, first of all, we all, especially in these times, we all have so much going on in our lives, right? Like, just getting
Mhm.
through the day to day and the way the world is right now. And then to throw in something like, really ugly on top of it. Like, it's so easy to just be like, you know, that can't be happening. And, just it, but, after a certain point though, um, you can't deny it anymore.
Mhm.
Um,
It becomes so, I mean, it like the abuse. the scale of the abuse that has occurred within this fellowship. I mean, it is at an it's undeniable. Like it came to like a fever pitch. Like there's no
Yeah,
um, and I don't want to get too sidetracked because I know I have some thoughts about why that's occurring as well. But
I do
you said
too.
something. Yeah, you said something that I wanted to actually key in again. You mentioned your father experiencing remorse. You mentioned another family member apologizing to you, and this is another tricky one
Hmm.
because there are abusers who will use an apology or even
Yeah,
weaponize like forgiveness. And
yeah,
and in your experience, how do you know whether someone is being genuine when or actually like weaponizing forgiveness? Because in forgiveness in particular, we know about Jesus' words about like forgiveness is necessary for salvation. So you can imagine the power that those words hold over someone who's a believer in the Bible and a believer in Jesus and God. This idea of forgiveness, and so how would you know if someone was genuine in this versus just trying to weaponize it?
yeah. Well, um, in my experience, and I don't know how this holds up to everyone's experience, but in my experience, the first time I brought up what he did, and I just brought up this one incident. There were other things that happened, but um, he, the first time I brought this up was, uh, see, what we're almost in 2024, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so 2007. Um, so yeah, about 7 years ago, something like that. Anyway, um, or no, I'm sorry, 2000. I don't know how to do it.
That's okay.
17 years ago.
Yeah.
uh, um, yeah, just the first time I brought this up, like, so he had, I was on a call with him and he lost his temper about something I said. I mentioned I wanted to go to graduate school, and he just like went off and on me and said that would be like a huge waste of time, blah blah blah. And I was like so confused, like why he would say that. But at any rate, because it actually ended up being the best thing I did for my career. But um, in any case, so I said to him, Tim, I might have started crying. Um, I said to him, when you lose your temper like that, and I remember apologizing. And this is something, again, when you own the shame, you apologize for reactions that you have, right? So, I'm sorry, but, whenever you lose your temper like that, I can't help it. But I remember what happened, when I was 16. And this was the first time we talked. And that made him even more mad. And he said, "What?" And he's like, you know, "I apologized to you for that." And I'm like, "You did?" I'm like, "I don't remember that." And again, I apologize. "I'm sorry, I don't remember that." Um, "I apologize to you for that. I know I did." "When was it? Do you remember where?" "I I can't remember, but I know I apologize." And so I was like, "Oh my gosh, well, I'm sorry, I can't remember, but this is how I feel." Anyway, like, does that sound like a real apology? Most people would
Mhm,
probably
mhm,
say no, or friends have told me, well, why didn't he just, if he really apologized, why didn't he just apologize again when you said you didn't remember?
mhm.
And then he turned that into, see, you're so selfish. And this is something that he always says, you're so selfish, and you know, all you care about is yourself. And so that's why you can't remember. And I was like, I don't even remember how the call ended, but I was really upset. And then fast forward another like 10, 11 years, to, I don't know, it's like 2018, 2019, somewhere in there. We were having some disagreements over family stuff, and um, I I asked him and his wife to go out to dinner with me so that we could sit down and talk things through. Um, because on the family front, there were some things we needed to address together, and so um, I brought this up again because he had many episodes, or there there are more incidents, um, like so he left the work, got married, moved back here.
This is your
And
brother, just to clarify.
yeah,
Yes.
oh,
Yeah.
I didn't mention he went into work, did I?
Right. No. Yeah. Okay. So
Oh,
he
okay.
went into work as well. Okay.
Yeah, so he actually, yeah, I'm not really telling I'm not really telling my history in the um
That's okay.
okay, so to back up a few steps, he went into the work right after um what I call the beatdown.
Mhm,
So when
mhm.
he was 25. Um and yeah, and then he was in the work um until I think like 2008, somewhere in there, 2008, 2009, got married. I think it was 2008. They lived in Laos for a little while, and then they moved back here, um, and stayed with my parents. So anyway, because he was very much in my life, because when I went to visit my parents, they were there, and there were multiple incidents where he just got mad at me about really just it'd probably be a waste of to give you examples of that. But he yeah, so we went out to dinner this time, and you know, just in the conversation trying to say, "Hey, let's try to work together." I was like, I do need to um talk about like what happens, what makes it difficult for me to work with you when you lose your temper. And by this time, my sister-in-law had witnessed some incidents. The first time she witnessed it, she told me that it really like blew her out of the water. Like she didn't see this side of him before, and it
Mhm.
really upset her. Um, but anyway, um, I forgot how I prefaced it, but I just said, you know, out of respect for your marriage, um, are you okay with me telling this story in front of your wife? Or are you okay with talking about this in front of, I won't mention her name, but,
Mhm, mhm.
um, and he was like, yeah, I don't have any secrets from her. So yeah. So I told the story of what happened just for her benefit. And then, said, you know, this is how it makes me feel when you lose your temper. It basically, I can't help it, but it brings me back to that place. Um, and so he said, well, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to say I'm sorry? Okay, I'm sorry. So to get back to your question, like, what is remorse and what is an apology? And I saw like, I think it was a meme or something not too long ago about three ingredients of an apology.
Mhm.
Number one, you say you're sorry. Say I'm sorry. Number two, it's it's my fault. Number three, this is what I'm doing to correct it.
Mhm.
And I feel like that if what's that saying? If an honest man recognizes their they're mistaken.
Mhm.
They either continue to be mistaken or what I wrote it down. If you don't mind, I'm gonna look.
Yes, by all means.
Um, he will either cease to be mistaken or cease to be honest. And
Mm.
I feel like so much of that is going on now as far as like, I guess they're calling it the cover up, um, with workers not, you know, um, owning up to what's going on in the church. Um, and yeah, it's, um, well, I guess it just basically boils down to whether you're honest or not.
Mhm, mhm. The difficulty of the subject matter, um, should never be used as an excuse for why we don't talk about something.
Right.
And, one of the things that I've talked about in private conversations recently is why are workers ready to address what I would call small evils when there's, like, something destroying
Oh,
lives?
interesting.
Why focus on the little evils when there's literally something destroying lives and souls?
Right.
You would think, like, if the watchman, there's the analogy of the watchman, like, sounding the warning, like, it isn't wolves are coming, it's that wolves are already in there and have been
Mhm.
for years and have been using the cover of this. They've been wearing a sheepskin, metaphorically.
Yep.
And why can they not why do they not love the flock enough to say we have to figure out, we have to call out what wolf behavior looks like.
Yeah.
This is the among the worst evils that could ever be perpetrated.
Yeah.
And so I suppose this leads me to just I wanted to ask your thoughts on we mentioned complicity before and what
Yeah.
complicity actually looks like. And the reason I think it's important to bring this into the discussion is because I think sometimes words get thrown around without fully maybe grasping the significance of what we're saying. Or people will misunderstand. Well, if you're saying a worker is complicit, are you saying they're guilty of this or that or a crime or things like that? And so, because I believe that at this point, all overseers are complicit. Every overseer is at this point complicit. If they're not
Oh,
actively fighting this, they are complicit. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on complicity and its effects.
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just trying to think of like so basically. So another reason why I um left the church was because I felt like you know even if all I did was go to meetings, um, that somehow I was passively supporting aspects of the church that that didn't that I just didn't agree with, like the whole, control thing and
Hmm.
um keeping people in submission and again I couldn't fully grasp like, what it was about that bothered me. But um it just came to a point where, I realized like I couldn't just take the parts that I liked
Hmm.
and ignore the rest. So, and I did like, so looking back, I mean, I was just talking about this with a friend the other day. Looking back, I think about like Sunday morning meetings. Like, I've been in a few different Sunday morning meetings over the years. And those were really formative years, like when I was in college and then my 20s. Um, and, I have a lot of really positive memories. It was, you know, those meetings were very intimate. I was lucky enough to, you know, be in meetings where the elders were just like incredibly warm and, just very much like to me, some of these elders were like the true shepherds, not the
Mm-hmm.
whippers.
Yeah.
Um, and so like, um, yeah, but like couldn't take just the parts that I like and forget about the rest. And um, I think, you know, if people can understand that if they are just, um, I've heard this a few times, like people saying, well, we're just going to trust in God to correct this whole thing.
Mm.
Um, First of all, that hasn't worked for many, many years. Second of all, like you still are keeping, the ones who are in power now, you're still keeping, you're backing up their power by not
Yeah.
speaking out against them.
Absolutely.
So I
Yeah.
don't know
It's
if
like,
that answered your question, but
well, I think you said something really profound, and I wanted to repeat that. You get to this point where you say, "I can't just take the good and ignore the bad."
mhm,
Like it gets to this place where I can't just pretend that because there's good aspects of it that everything's okay. And it's almost like as you're describing kind of like your relationship to your father.
yeah,
You couldn't just say, take the good and say like, there were times where he was very loving, very caring, um, that kind of thing, and they just somehow forget or just wash away or whatever um, the abuse that you suffered.
mhm,
Like it doesn't work like that. It's yeah. So to be complicit doesn't mean you know. Uh, I guess how do I want to put this? If I was to, I mean, share something that a friend of mine has shared, and if he's watching this, he'll know. Um, the overall experience doesn't equate to the average experience.
mhm,
Good doesn't negate bad,
yeah,
and even mostly good doesn't negate bad. And so I think
mhm,
his analogy is something like, if you take a 1,000-mile road trip and you crash your car in the last mile, you describe the trip as the trip you crashed on, not the one where you drove 999 um, uneventful miles.
yeah,
You know, it's all the good doesn't cancel out the bad. It doesn't wash it away and make it like not happen.
especially not this kind of bad.
Yeah, yeah.
We all are a mixed bag, right? Excuse me.
Hmm. And so, yeah,
We all are a mixed bag. I mean, any human relationship that you have, you do have to take some bad with the good.
right,
but
right.
but
And I think we should, or I should clarify. This isn't me saying that I expect that the experience, everyone's experience in this fellowship should be 100% positive. That's an unrealistic expectation as well.
mhm,
To say that, well, there should never be any, this should always be this perfect idealistic world where everything is perfect and everything's just love and peace and joy and so on. Like, of course, there's going to be difficult experiences, but I think there's also a difference between the thing the bad things that happen just by virtue of the fact that people are human and make mistakes and we're emotional and so on and so forth, and calculated predatorial behavior.
mm.
There's a difference between making honest human mistakes and being an abuser.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And so in thinking about like, well, it's not perfect, I feel as though there's been a lot of, um, well, it was an honest mistake. It was a moment of weakness. It was, no, it wasn't.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, talk about being honest. I haven't been following along really closely with everything that's being said. Like
Mm.
I
Nor
get
have I
like,
at this point.
yeah, but even from the beginning, like it just, I don't know, um, I, it just was really re-traumatizing to read some of the accounts, um, and recognize it, like, there it's almost like somebody wrote a textbook on how to be a narcissistic abuser, um, and made this a requirement, for some of these workers to, memorize this textbook and pass an exam because the
Mhm.
patterns are so striking. And, one of the first things I said to a friend, who still goes to meetings, um, and we were talking about, whether or not I would come out and share my story, or my experience. You know, I I was like, um, but no, what if nobody believes me? Or what if no, or I know what he's gonna do. He's gonna. Speaking about my brother, I forgot if I mentioned my dad passed away a little over a year ago.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, like I know what he's gonna do. He's gonna go around telling everybody that she made the whole story up. I know this because he's already doing it.
Mhm.
Um, and he's like, you know how many perpetrators are doing that now. Um, so
Yeah,
it's
that's their defense. It was made
yeah,
up to try and I mean, it seems like it's a classic human response, in a sort of pathological sense. Let's discredit the victim,
yeah,
you know? And we recognize in one sense, if this was a court of law, that there's a certain burden of proof that falls upon the accuser. But
sure,
we're not debating this in the court of law. And, in a previous in a previous conversation, I believe it was with a lady by the name of Megan Connor, a couple of episodes back, she mentioned I mean, we could talk about, first of all, the rates of false reporting, which are 2 to 7%. Like, it's
yeah,
and if it's children, it's
minimum,
it's almost 0. But on top of that, if somebody's making a false accusation, that's a red flag, and you should ask, "Why is that false accusation being made?"
yes, yes,
Let's look to understand that,
yeah,
instead of just assuming that this person is malicious, just maliciously trying to slander somebody, because that's been one of the defenses that's been used in this whole crisis is people are trying to destroy the truth. They're trying to destroy the fellowship. They're trying to just no. And like I said, the number of false accusations turn out to be very, very, very small.
mhm,
Not only that, like a seasoned investigator is actually very good at parsing out, asking the right questions and parsing out whether something's a true or a false allegation. And so, I
right,
think there's quite a high degree of confidence that anything that's been reported through any formal organization is
mhm,
thoroughly vetted. These are
yeah,
not accidental things.
yeah,
And well, as we bring this to a close, I wanted to give you an opportunity to share some final thoughts. Just if someone's listening to this conversation today, you shared so many different things. You shared your experience. You've shared many thoughts. But was there anything that we missed that you wanted to make sure that you shared, or just if someone heard this conversation today, what would you like them to take away?
yeah. So I especially want to um, send a message to survivors out there who, um, whether or not you've decided to share your story, that's obviously your decision. And but um, even though it feels like it many times, um, please keep in mind that you are not alone. And I think that right now, um, there are many people there are many survivors who are going through sort of like a re traumatization
Hmm.
because of what I call the turning away. Um, and I think now more than ever, whether you're a survivor or a supporter of survivor, now is the time that we really need to um, stick together and support each other.
Hmm.
Um, so many want to just like move on with their lives. This thing has been exhausting. It's only been what, like this is December, 10 months.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and it's just, I don't know about you, even though I haven't really been following along too closely, hearing about all these, you know, all the different perpetrators and what they've been doing, it's just mentally exhausting. Um,
Mhm.
but that's a good sign. The thing that is most concerning to me is the ones who don't feel pain. So there's another strategy that perps use um, to sort of put their victims down. And that is, they like going around telling people that they're crazy, right?
Mhm.
Um, but if you think of this, if you were to break your leg and feel no pain, like had no reaction to that, and if I were to watch you break your leg and have no reaction to that, there's something wrong with, one or both of us, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I'd say so,
I
yeah.
mean, and it may be like, there may be something else going on. Like maybe, you have some neurological disease that prohibits you from feeling pain. But regardless, like if I saw you break your leg and was like, oh well, Jonathan, I'm just gonna move on. There is something wrong with me, like mentally,
Mhm, mhm.
that can do that. And I do feel like, unfortunately, I do feel like workers go through a lot of abuse too. Like maybe it's
I
more
agree.
psychological, emotional.
Emotional, for sure.
Yeah. But after a certain point, I think just in order to survive, um, they just become emotionally shut down.
Their emotions are deadened as a almost a survival response.
Yeah. And like
Mm,
to me, so in addition to not being parents, I do think that because of the experience of being in the work and having to toe that line, that, um, you know, it's just not a natural life, which we all recognize,
mm,
right?
mm.
Um, and of course, I'm not saying this about every worker. There are a few workers out there who just, they've been solid gold through all of this.
Mhm, mhm,
Um, but, you know, when you become so disconnected like that, like, how is that a sign of mental health?
mhm.
And so back to like a message for survivors. If you are feeling pain right now, if you are feeling like, you know, sort of a re-traumatization from people in the church not fully recognizing what you went through and not just recognizing it, but not doing anything. It's that third part of that. It's that third ingredient of a true apology. Here's what I'm doing to correct it. So
Mhm,
if you
mhm,
are feeling pain from not receiving a true apology, that's a sign of health.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and not that it makes it okay, of course, but there is nothing wrong with you. And,
mhm.
if you are experiencing this, to a degree where you're having suicidal thoughts, um, there is help out there
Mhm.
and you can survive. And I'm saying that because I know. until we recognize the depth of the evil that is happening now, um, not only are survivors going to continue to suffer, but I have no doubt that there will be more victims.
Mhm.
And how sickening is that? Like,
Mhm.
you any person who doesn't just like feel like completely nauseated at children being harmed, whether it be through physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse,
Mhm.
like there really is something wrong with them
Mhm.
and they need to get help. But I think on the flip side of things, there are a lot of people who I believe um, have more power than they think they can. I've had people tell me, well, there's nothing I know what's going on with you, but there's nothing I can do about it. You can. You absolutely can. It could start with something simple, like if you're still in the church and, you know, having meetings in your home, whether you're an elder or, if you're don't have a meeting in your home, but you have friends over, it's your home.
Mhm.
You can shut the door on anyone that you want. You there is no wrongdoing in you saying to somebody, I'm sorry, you're not welcome here. And maybe if you're kind enough, you may want to have a little conversation with them about why. But like, all you have to do is say, you're not welcome here.
Mhm.
Again, not trying to dismantle the church. I think that, there are elders. I hear stories and I know some elders who I think are trying to do the right thing.
Mhm. There are.
Um, and that gives me hope.
Yeah.
Um, this is not the time to turn away. This is the time to face up and keep on pressing
Mhm.
for that change.
And I think, two thoughts that come from that. First one being, if anybody feels like the last 10 months have been exhausting, put yourself in a survivor's shoes who might have lived this for the last 3, 4, 5 decades.
Hmm. It has
That
been.
that that's exhausting. Um,
Yeah.
and secondly, if you are a believer, if you believe in God and you believe that God has the ability to give you power and strength, then ask God for that. Ask Him to give you the strength to face this, to face the evil, to face the ugly, to face the distressing, to face the heartbreak. We None of us want to go through difficult emotions. It's our natural instinctive impulse to try to run away from these things, and I don't want to take the spotlight from you and your story, but I just want to say, like, it's not easy for me to do this. Um, I do it for this podcast. I do it for another podcast. I do it for clients I work with. It's not an easy thing to do, but I have the capacity to do it. And so I choose to do it. But I hope nobody mistakes my, I guess, degree of hopefully professionalism with not feeling something as I go through these stories. But it's possible.
Yeah. I'm sure that, I mean, really, Jonathan, I, I am so grateful for what you're doing. Um, and I mean, yeah, in these times, it's really like just I don't know, it's like like somebody throwing oh my gosh, I'm blanking. What's the ring that you throw out to somebody who's in an
A
ocean?
life preserver.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A life
Yes,
It
that's
really
okay.
is like a life preserver when like of people like you. Also, big shout out to the founders of the Advocates for Truth,
Mhm, mhm,
and thank you to all of you for um, using the term survivors, not victims. Um,
mm,
I think I can speak for most victims when I say that we prefer not to be called a victim. We prefer to be called a survivor. And if you haven't come to recognize that, if you're a survivor and you don't feel like, you still feel like you're just struggling, um, you are a survivor though. Like if you are, like, every day that you wake up and you struggle, you are surviving. And I think that, you know, like, out of this, I really hope that there will be sort of like a um, community that comes together. I think it is happening already.
mhm, mhm.
Um, and with a community, um, even the ones who feel the weakest can thrive.
Mhm.
We all need each other, whether you're in the church or not.
But I think this is the time to, I almost want to say, put aside church boundaries and the
Mm.
walls that have been set up, and recognize our common humanity here.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what Jesus did. Outside of the religious structure, he went and found people.
Hmm.
And, another, worker has mentioned the healing ministry of Christ, and really that was the intention of it. That's what he did. He healed and he helped people. And so, you know, maybe for those who are still a part of this fellowship or church, consider knocking down those walls
Yeah. Yeah.
and just
Big
saying,
shout out. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, I was gonna say, just knock down those walls.
Yeah.
Forget about the boundaries of the church and say, there's someone in need, I'll help.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I hope he doesn't mind me doing this, but big shout out to Greg Swanson and other workers like him.
Jared Snyder.
Jared Snyder. Oh, you know him. Oh,
I
okay.
do.
Small
Yes.
world. I mean, although, he's not in the work. I think he's pretty public about that.
Yeah,
Jared's
yeah,
not. Let's not start
correct.
rumors. I
Uh,
haven't been in touch with Greg in a while, but, like, true true healers in the healing ministry. And by the way, folks, months ago, I heard there was a rumor that Greg was trying to be overseer. That's like the furthest from the truth. Um, he's spoken to me personally about this, like, just the danger in, the power and the adoration that workers receive, and how that just is breeding grounds for narcissism. And you know, he recognizes that. And he said that he does not want to be an overseer.
mm. Well, maybe we can close out with this, and I'll give you some final thoughts as well. But for any workers who are watching this, who have watched any of this, take courage, have courage, show courage. Um, now is the time. Um, none of us want to tear down those who feel genuinely called to preach and minister the gospel. But be courageous. Be courageous and take a stand for what is right and for what is true. What is truth? What is righteous? What is justice? What is mercy? Take a stand and make your loyalty to Jesus and not to a hierarchy.
Hmm. And a hierarchy that perpetuates abuse.
Mhm. Well, Isabel, I want to say thank you so much for being on today. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your insights, and
Yeah.
thank you for just being an encouragement to all other survivors out there.
Yeah. And thank you so much for the time. And um, yeah, I kind of feel like I had so many thoughts and you helped me get through it all. I feel like we could talk for hours. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning into The Hidden Truth. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review, because that helps this podcast to reach and inspire more people. It is so important that these stories are heard so that we continue to raise awareness and support victim survivors in their healing journey. For those who've been affected but haven't found your voice yet, I hope these stories inspire you to keep moving forward on your healing journey. Take care.